Hello and welcome to Infrastructure Matters, the podcast dedicated to exploring the dynamic world of infrastructure, asset management, and public works. I'm your host, David Jenkins, Chief Executive of IPWEA. Today, we're joined by Lunda Asmani, President of the Government Finance Officers Association, and Ashay Prabhu, Advisor to GFOA and founder of Modelv Group. Together, we'll discuss the state of infrastructure finance in the US, how global asset management practices are evolving, and why collaboration between finance and engineering professionals is critical for building sustainable communities. We'll explore topics from capital planning and ESG to AI in public finance, and how professionals worldwide can better prepare for the challenges ahead. So welcome to Infrastructure Matters podcast, and I'm delighted to have two guests with me today, two very special guests with me today. So we've got Lunda Asmani, who's the president of the Government Finance Officers Association, all the way over from the US, and has been joining us for our 5-day conference in sunny Sydney. And we have been on the sunshine for you, Lunda. Have you had a good time?
I've had a great time, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
You are always welcome. And our very good friend, Ashay Prabhu, who is the advisor to the Government Finance Officers Association, as well as being the founder of Modelv. I'm going to go straight into it. So obviously we've done some work together, both organisations, IPWEA and GFOA. Where do you see, Lunda, or both of you actually, what's the state of play of capital planning in the US at the moment? Where are we up to in terms of infrastructure asset management?
Well, I think first and foremost is in the United States, we have a serious infrastructure deficit, what I refer to it. Just the quality of infrastructure, the age of infrastructure is something that we're paying attention to, but there is a lot of work to be done in terms of just making the infrastructure meet the needs of the public, but also having plan for maintaining the infrastructure that we have and the new infrastructure that we're bringing online as well.
Because the reality is, and you correct me if I'm wrong, we had an infrastructure or a double-I infrastructure bill that came through, $1 billion. Well, that's the headline figure. That's basically gone into infrastructure. Was back in the previous administration and the Biden administration. But how have we got to that point? Because is the issue that assets have literally been allowed to crumble and we've got to rebuild them all again, and hence we've got this massive injection of capital?
It's a combination of things, and one of the things that we'll talk about down the line is the way that the U.S. primarily finances infrastructure. Is we don't do a lot of pay as you go. Most of our infrastructure is financed through bonding and municipal financing, borrowing, for lack of a better word, is how we fund it. And so therefore communities sometimes find themselves not having the capacity to borrow, and as a result have to make the choice of foregoing infrastructure investment just because of the cost of investing in infrastructure. So we are seeing a deficit in that area as well for that reason.
But what about the maintenance and renewal? So you've got existing, we are talking in terms of quantum, billions of dollars worth of assets across the US. And in terms of maintenance and renewal, and that's different to asset management. But what is the understanding or the maturity around asset management planning? What that means, the importance of. You've heard the conversations today. It's not just a US issue, right? But where are you in the United States with some of this thinking?
Part of the challenge is just the competition for resources. As I mentioned, we finance our assets primarily through municipal financing, and therefore in our annual budget, there's a line item for bond and interest payments.
Yeah.
So when we look at that, we tend to look at that as investment towards infrastructure. And so you may be spending millions of dollars just on debt service on an asset that you put online 20, 30 years ago, and therefore maintaining that asset is an additional layer of resource that you need. And in an era where you're competing, and in the U.S., local government is police and fire and schools, there's always that competition for resources. So at the bottom line, it's always, well, we've already invested in infrastructure. We're paying interest on the debt. We may not have the additional resources to also spend on the maintenance of it. And therefore, what ends up happening is we do a lot of patchwork along the way to the point where you need to replace the asset once again after its useful life.
So very reactive.
Yes.
And when you're talking about resourcing, are you talking about the purely financial or financial and human?
Financial and human.
Yeah, okay. Would you agree with that, Ashay?
I think so, yeah. I think whether it's the US or Australia, the infrastructure assets are the biggest number on the balance sheet. There's no doubt about that piece. Community expectations are rising, but more importantly, we ought not forget that the infrastructure that primarily got built in the 80s and 90s, whether it's Australia, UK, South Africa, or the US, or Canada, that infrastructure has got to a point where it's not necessarily in poor physical shape, but the demand from the community from an obsolescence perspective, modernization of the standard means it requires a refurbish because it doesn't have enough capacity, it is not fit for the future needs, it doesn't have gender impact balance, or it's affected by climate. I think that's where a lot of the pressure is also coming from. So yes, capital planning in the US, which traditionally was a 5-year exercise, I think there is a lot of maturity now in the industry to make it 25 years because money is running out. Bonds are not necessarily easy to attract if the credit rating of the organization isn't at par. So it is putting pressure on all of us to make sure that the investments are wisely made.
And look, just for our listenership, they might not be completely across all this. You've talked about bonds, both of you have. So when we think about financing new assets, and we've just talked about looking after existing assets, in terms of getting a revenue base from local government in Australia, it's typically rate paying fund, right? But it's different in the US, isn't it? Just explain how the bond system works, just high level.
Sure. So from a revenue perspective of a local government, we also depend on rates through property taxes, but some local governments in the U.S. are also able to assess sales tax.
Yeah.
So there's a component of the sales tax that's part of the local revenue, and there are some communities that also generate or collect income taxes from the income earners in the community. So some of that taxes goes to the federal government, to the state government, and some of that stays locally. So those are like the three primary sources of revenues for most local governments in the U.S., and it varies by state. And so how the United States primarily funds public infrastructure is through the issuance of bonds, which is essentially going to the market and borrowing money. And the federal government provides an incentive by making those who invest in those municipal bonds not pay taxes on the interest that they earn. So these bonds are tax exempt as an incentive. And the thinking really is, if I need a bridge today, I will borrow money to build the bridge today rather than wait 20 years when I have the cash to build the bridge. So that's kind of the philosophy around how the U.S. funds most of its infrastructure is through borrowing rather than pay as you go. In the case of utilities like treatment plants, wastewater plants, we issue bonds for those, but the revenue from that infrastructure, for that asset or that utility, is typically what repays for those bonds. So not necessarily the rates from the community, but it's the fees that the community pays for that service. Those fees are used in repayment of that principal and interest. Okay.
And the GFOA has taken a real interest. I mean, the big difference, and we probably should have started with this, the big difference between the two membership bodies, IPWEA and GFOA is predominantly public finance professionals, right?
Yes.
Accounting and finance. So why the interest in asset management planning? Why you've been very proactive in this approach. Why do you think your members need to understand asset management planning?
Well, for two reasons. Recently, there was a report that came out, Bridging the Gap, that basically analyzed the state of infrastructure. And over the next 10 years, part of the research showed that, for example, surface transportation, roads and bridges, there's a $3.5 trillion worth of investment needed in the next 10 years. On the books, there's only 2.3. So there's a gap of $1.2 trillion over the next years in terms of just surface transportation. In energy, same thing. In drinking water and so forth. And so there's a recognition that not only is there an infrastructure deficit, But because of how we fund infrastructure, we also need to take an active approach in policies that are favorable for the issuance of municipal bonds or borrowing, which is how we pay for these infrastructure. So there's been a huge interest in that as well. But then also some changes in our accounting standards. When you look at any community's balance sheet, by far assets are the drivers of the balance sheet. And therefore, there's been more interest in how are we accounting for these assets, how are we managing these assets. And that's where we know that Australia is ahead in the sense of managing assets. And we've developed this partnership with IPWEA and GFOA so that we can also learn and get some knowledge from you guys in terms of how we can be more proactive in this.
Yeah. Why is it, Ashay, do you think the accountants are sort of taking the lead with this in the US?
It is a finance issue at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And David, if you look back, Australia in the early 90s, 20 million population, 4 million taxpayers, vast infrastructure. We had to do more and more with less and less. The United States, 300 million population, vast infrastructure, but lots of money. And when you are in that situation with a lot of money and a lot of build, you get into this mindset of we'll fix it when it breaks, and whilst it's functioning, we'll keep it going. Whereas the Australian practice was more around let's intervene before it hits the F point or the fail point, to look at alternative options of how we can arrest that decay. And I think after 20 years, we've come up a little bit ahead in that strategic asset management game. But at the end of the day, it's a money game. And at the end of the day, finance have to have that line of sight to say, show me how much money I need. Don't tell me last year plus or minus 5%. CFOs are getting more and more mature in terms of asking the right questions of the engineers. The engineers have got fiscally fluent because the auditing standards are now picking up on the anomalies on the balance sheets and the financial statements. So I think as an industry, we've matured to the point to recognize that it's not just the largest number on the balance sheet, but it's also the largest expense on our P&L. And we need to take control of that.
But do you think that sort of Australia sort of been fortunate in the sense that, back in the 90s, whatever, there was an issue around local government financial sustainability. Out of that was born the National Asset Management Framework. Broadly, the states and territories decided that we need an asset management plan. We need asset management plans. We need to link them to long-term financial plans. Does the same sort of, regulatory environment exist in the US?
Not to the level it is over here. Yes, we have been super fortunate. The National Asset Management Accounting Framework did lift a lot of the emphasis back in 2007. There was some great work done by the renewal gap analysis by Dr. Penny Burns and Jeff Roda back in the day.
Yep.
Chris Champion, who has always been pioneering the concept of we need to manage assets to continue to deliver sustainable services. I think a lot of that over time has constantly worked on our psyche. And with the introduction of the accrual accounting framework to shift from historical cost to replacement cost, I think changed the game for Australia, where the engineers and the accountants kind of came on the same page and were able to fiscally share ideas around that prudence. So you were not talking from two different sets of book. We haven't completely solved it, but we're in a lot better shape than we were 20 years ago.
Let me just, Lunda, I'm going to come to you now actually, because let me just ask you this question. So I've always admired the GFOA in terms of you're very proactive, future thinking. You're looking at the ways in which the accounting profession finance profession is changing. And you focus on asset management planning. And then Ashay's talked about bringing the finance community and the engineering community together. Is that happening? You're leading the way, but as the engineer, even in your own particular jurisdiction where you work, are you working closely with the engineering community? Because it's a common problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah, yes. And if I may slightly go back to the global financial crisis in 2008, right? Yep. In the US and most countries around the world, to address that, the U.S. put a lot of investment in growing, government investing in infrastructure. And so since 2008, there has been additional funding and additional money just coming into communities to invest in infrastructure, whether it's roads, whether it's bridges, all of these things that haven't been taken care of for quite a number of years. So with that money, it did require finance officers to be more proactive, but then also to start a level of management of assets that we had not seen in quite a number of years. There's so much money flowing into local communities, and it became apparent that there needed to be some systems in how we invest this money, two, how we account for this money in our financial systems, and Ashay talked about the different ways. But then also, how do you partner with those that oversee the assets? So, for example, in my role as the chief financial officer of a public school district, which is a local government, many of my counterparts actually wear the title of chief financial officer and operations, because those two things go hand in hand. My district happens to be a very big district, and therefore those are separated. But in most public school districts, the finance and the operations are one entity. And that does require working closely together with the engineering profession. If you go back to the history of local governments in the United States, the very first, we call them city managers, you call them CEOs and GMs, many of them were engineers. And so engineers have been running many of our communities historically. And so I think there's that recognition that happens. And with all of this additional funding that's now flowing into our communities, that level of partnership is only enhanced. And so there is a great partnership between public works and finance and operations and plant management at all levels of government, at local, state, and federal as well. So that partnership does exist quite heavily as well.
You've heard in some of the speeches, and this isn't a new thing, it's certainly not, in terms of capacity and capability in local government, having the right people. Remote rural regional councils in Australia struggle so in terms of the human resource element. You can have all the systems, processes and frameworks in the world, but if you don't have the people to do this stuff, is that the same issue in the US as it is here in Australia? And is it beginning to be solved or not?
We are beginning to address it, but it is a similar issue. GFOA commissioned a study. We partnered to commission a study, I believe 3 or 4 years ago. And in that study, we saw that there's a major deficit in public finance. Many of people in my roles are either aging out of the profession, they're retiring, or they're coming back as consultants just because there aren't enough people in the profession. Secondly, we've seen that our graduate schools that offer master's programs, there aren't that many programs specifically focused on public finance, and this is the same for public works and engineering as well. So one of the things that we've begun to do is how do we attract younger professionals into the profession? But we've also been looking at what are the qualifications to get into these roles. We have found that some of our qualifications are very restrictive. You say you require 5 years of experience, or you require a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, when you really don't require those skills. You could come in, you could learn on the job. And so we have been just evaluating the entire system in terms of how do you recruit, who do you recruit, where do you recruit. But I think our challenges in terms of manpower are similar. And then with COVID, government has been rigid in terms of work. How you work. Many of our young people coming into the profession now prefer remote work and that type of flexibility. And in government, sometimes doesn't lend itself to that. People still want to come to City Hall and pay their utility bill. They want to come to City Hall and talk to someone. And so we have begun to become more creative in how we can schedule the work time and provide that flexibility to our employees. But the challenges are indeed there, similar to what you're experiencing here.
And the applying just the other dimension to it as well. Whilst as a community in the US or in Australia or in the UK anywhere, we've got the public works engineers, we've got the accountants, we've got the planners, we've got the CFOs. I think generally working reasonably well together, consensus is building up in a lot of areas. But the time span of the thinking is also very important. Are we collectively coming together with a 1 year view of the budget, with a 5 year view of the budget, or a 20-year view of the budget that is based on multiple scenarios, to take that bias out of the thinking. And the time span is often what has got forgotten in the context of financial planning, where a 5-year time span doesn't give you the reality of what might be coming down the gurgler. And strategic asset management is strategic because it is really about the 10, 20 years, not the 3 to 5 years. And
that's,
so one of the best practice policies in the GFOA on capital planning, we've actually taken the best parts of the Australian IPWEA and the IIMM guidance and extended that timeline recommendation from 5 years to now 30 years with the hope that that becomes a way of life.
And you mentioned a good point there, and part of it is bringing more people at the table. And so one of the things that GFOA has done is we've kind of reimagined, rethinking our initiatives, our membership structure. So it used to be a GFOA member, you were either the CFO or the budget director as an individual. And so now we've gone to this concept of an organizational membership because we recognize that there are more people in the organization that are part of the finance world. And so within public works, within the police department, within the fire department, there are people in there that are making daily financial decisions, and therefore making a bigger umbrella of membership and making them part of our Finance Office Association allows us to have that more collaborative involvement. So the next couple of years, when you come to a GFOA conference, you're not just going to see CFOs. You're going to see folks that work in public works. You're going to see folks that work in the fire department. And I think that just brings different conversations to the table, recognizing that it is a systemic approach to problem solving. And, when it comes to asset management, having the right people at the table, because, I may look at it as just dollars and cents, go with a cheaper option, which may not be the best option. But having somebody in the room that thinks differently and gives you a different perspective, I think that'll get us where we need to go.
Okay. Can I just go back to the bonds side of things? If you're looking to borrow money, build new infrastructure, part of getting that money, is there a requirement around you've actually got a plan for asset management? You've linked it. You actually understand your current state of assets. There's a whole of life cycle. There's some thinking behind that to get that money?
Great question, David. And Dr. Kyle Wedberg in our capital planning committee at the GFO is working really hard along with the other members on the committee and Lunda's help and last year with Tanya Garost's help to get organizations like Standards & Poor's and Moody's to really also start to get into understanding the practice of asset management to have that evaluation. At the moment, unfortunately, it's not. It's based on a number of criteria, some of which are subjective, but essentially comes down to the traditional accounting practice of looking at the financial viability based on amortization and future cost. But we are working very, very hard to at least provide those counties or those municipalities with a solid 20-year plan to get more points in that rating perspective, and also be looked at favorably from an insurance premium perspective, which is another topic in the US. A lot of the infrastructure assets are insured, unlike Australia, which has a guaranteed NDRA framework. But work is being done, and every funding mechanism will require a level of scrutiny. And yes, work is being done in that regard. But right at the moment, the answer is not quite.
So, that's one approach, obviously advocating to, the big ratings agency, that's fine. But, are we getting to a point where the actual communities are demanding some of these things or they just don't understand?
I think it's a combination. Right now, as Ashay pointed out, currently the requirement right now, even like in the state of Connecticut where I live, is to at minimum have a 5-year plan. When you go for a bond rating, they would want to see a minimum a 5-year plan looking forward, because that tells them two things. One is your ability to pay for the assets you have on the plan now, but it also looks into the future, knowing that if you have a couple of $1 million project in the next 5 years, you're going to come back and want to borrow money each year of those projects going live. And it goes back to your ability to pay. But I think the next phase is what Ashay is talking about, is actually strategically managing those assets and determining, are they viable? Some of these assets, could they pay for themselves? And those types of things. That's the next level, I think, in the bond rating world. We're not quite there, but I believe we are heading there now.
I don't know if you listened to the Minister Bishop yesterday, or even Jeff Cooper from the Infrastructure Commission in New Zealand. I think they've done a really good job at creating a burning platform and around the need and the priority for asset management. They come up with statistics like New Zealand, one of the highest spenders of infrastructure, but it's one of the lowest in terms of value for money.
Yeah.
Very simple. Everyone can understand that. And they've come up with other statistics. I've been to conferences where there's about 20 people saying the same thing. It's and it's getting that message across. Do you think there's an opportunity there in the US to actually sell some of those messages?
Yeah, I think part of the theme of the Government Finance Officers Association Capital Planning Committee this year is it's called the art of storytelling for a capital plan, which is how do you actually, in an ethical way, with the least bias, sell the capital plan story to the community to gain their buy-in and their consensus. Shane Kavanagh, who is a champion at fiscal fluency, actually had a lot of work done on how to be fiscally fluent in presenting these numbers. But still a lot of work has to be done in terms of creating the basis for measuring these things and being able to be explained in a way that the general community can understand. In fact, we have a name for that general community mascot now in the US. It's called Jack.
Yeah.
And Jack listens to the stories.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of work to do in terms of having the template for that story and the fiscal numbers of how to create that story.
We're flitting around a bit here, but I'm going to go back to the people side. The GFOA is in Canada. Got a good membership in Canada. I always look at the Canadians and I think, you've done something right here. Because through Infrastructure Canada and the FCM grant funding, looking at municipals, local small municipalities in Canada, they've said, you know what? We actually need to ring fence some funding here and develop people and help them develop them through educational programs and asset management planning. Right? And we've long advocated that to other governments. Do you think there's an opportunity in the US to do the same thing and to look at your friends next door and actually sort of take some of those ideas around specifically, getting funding from government to raise capacity and capability?
I think so. I think, like I said earlier, I think traditionally, when you look at the components of any macroeconomy, you have the consumption, investments, and government spend. Our government spend historically has been on building things. But there's also an opportunity that you could do that and grow the economy as well, which seems to be the goal of all of our administrations. And especially when you have a model like Canada that's been doing it, I think it's an opportunity for us as well. Because, as I mentioned earlier, we have shortages not just in the public works sector and the finance sector. We have shortages in multiple sectors throughout the economy. And so I think when we talk about bringing jobs back and job training opportunities and all those things, we need to do more. I think there are some states that are doing better than others in terms of that, but the federal government hasn't stepped up yet to that level.
When you think about the big issues that are facing the world, I've always said this, engineers are the greatest problem solvers, but I've got a strong affinity for the accounting and finance profession as well. Sustainability, climate change, aging infrastructure, capacity and capability. These are big problems. They're not going away and they seem to be getting harder and harder. Whilst we see Australia and we go, yep, they're, in terms of strategic asset management, they're pretty good. They're leading the way. But we still talk about the same things 10, 20 years later. Are we really making a difference? And are we really going to make a difference to some of this stuff?
Well, I think and I can answer that from a global perspective. What I have noticed as a trend is in our sector, the ability to understand the depth of the problem, which is the maturity of the practicing asset manager or the CFO, has significantly increased. And when you are more aware psychologically of the issues that exist, it seems to feel like it's getting harder and harder, because we now actually know what the numbers mean, and we know what the magnitude of the issues might be. But at the same time, the increase in maturity and the ability of this sector to be able to present their scenarios means politicians and elected members now have less bias or less chances of becoming roadblocks for the engineers that can solve the problems or the finance people that can fund the problems. To give you a context, David, 20 years ago, you hardly found a mayor or a elected member at events like these. Now we do. In fact, now we are at a point where mayors and elected members in their gazettes or in their newsletters really are calling out for renewal of existing assets before we build new stuff. There is a growing recognition of understanding that 20-year backlog, not just the 5-year or the 3-year backlog. So I think times have changed. And if anything, the best news is that the political world is acknowledging the facts and providing the finance and engineers with an opportunity to fix it. We won't fix it 100%. Money has to come from somewhere, something has to give. But I think we've got better and clever ways of playing that game and playing it more ethically and with the least bias. So, and I think that's great news.
And you know that's all positive. But isn't the system broken? Because we have short-term political cycles, politicians, whether they're at the federal level or at the local level, they have different drivers around things compared to the people that are actually managing and looking after assets. So is the system broken?
I don't think the system, well, I wouldn't like to say it as the system broken. I think the system is what it is. And as engineers and finance professionals, our job is to acknowledge the system as is and navigate ways around trying to remove the ability of decision makers to make the wrong decisions. And that's our job. At the end of the day, if Australia shifts from 3% in very poor infrastructure to 10% in very poor infrastructure, we'll still have to find ways to pay for that or reduce that, or alternative ways to do things. And that's just way of life. And it makes life interesting, if anything.
Well, and that's a good point, Ashay. So I refer to them as not necessarily the system is broken, but you have these pendulum shifts depending on who's in charge, whether it's at the federal or at the state level. And so, you go one direction for 8 years, and then you kind of shift back one way or the other. But I think there have been attempts. So, for example, in the U.S., where most of our infrastructure is financed, this is overseen by the Security and Exchange Commission in the U.S. Recently, they have implemented this ESG requirement that our projects need to have some, economic input, environmental considerations, societal considerations. And I think that's part of the shift as well, right? So regardless of how the pendulum shifts, these ESG requirements now have become part of consideration on how the credit rating of a community, how valuable are these bonds that you're issuing. And so I think we're making, slowly chipping at this. I think I heard that today, chipping at this tree, and one day the tree will fall, and we'll get there.
Just in terms of sort of bringing professions together, and both of you in various different ways have talked about this, but is it a question, and I this is probably more of a local government context, but when we think about the decision-making process, typically the finance team at the table, and typically the engineering team at the table. But when we consider assets, there's the urban foresters, there's the arborists, there's the public open space people. They don't get a seat at the table, but they innately, they manage assets. They manage different types of assets. And through some of the publications that we're developing now, we're trying to get a shared language around some of this stuff. Because whilst arborists are managing assets, they might not talk about asset management with the same language that the engineers do, right? Do you think one of the bigger, one of the opportunities is really, and I think you might be doing this in terms of your membership change, is trying to get a common language and a shared language and understanding when we consider how we best manage assets?
I think so, and I'll give you an example. So I go back. I'll give you two examples. First example is early in my local government career, I had an HR director who talked about in local government, we have all the professions, A to Z. We have accountants, to teachers, to zookeepers. All of these are part of the process. And so I think when you talk about bringing people together, that's one. But two, in my district where I work now, where we have a massive 25-year plan to build schools, but part of the school construction project is not just looking at the engineers and the architects and the financing. When we build a school, we bring in teachers, classroom teachers, and they are part of speccing the asset. When they're part of speccing the asset, where are the classrooms? Where should the break room be? How far is the break room from the kindergarten classroom versus the third grade classroom? And so there are these things that, as a finance person, I may not think of. As an architect designing the building, or as an engineer, you may not think of. You may be looking at things like cost and how, those types of things. But as I talk about accountants to zookeepers, in the U.S., local governments manage hospitals. And so you have the same conversation when you're building a brand new hospital or adding a wing to a hospital. So I think bringing more people at this table, developing that common language, we don't quite call it that, but I think there's quite a bit of input that goes in many of these public infrastructure, specifically at the local level right now. And I think that's one way to start building that common language is, okay, what do we call a cafeteria strategically located by a kindergarten versus by the fifth grade classroom? And if there's language around that, then I think that's how you kind of build this lexicon of knowledge around public infrastructure.
And the maintainability language as well, in terms of, to give you a classic example, a new buzzword in government is placemaking. And without naming the city, there have been examples of placemaking where the placemakers have, for example, installed these beautiful lights on trees in parks that come and self-light up at about 7 p.m. in the evening. And to find only in about 6 months, they had wires hanging off the trees because the birds had chewed those lights out. And now it's a huge maintenance task for the city because the placemakers, the asset planners, and the engineers weren't on the same page. So I think that language is important. That the work that IPWEA is doing in that space is quite critical. And again, it's in the early stages, but taking a step in that direction to bring the natural assets people, the arborists, the parks and gardens people in the conversation, I think is a step in the right direction.
Okay. I just want to end on the whole topic around the future of the public finance professional. And I said right at the start, I admire the GFOA because I really think you're trying to push the boundaries here, because you correct me if I'm wrong, but public finance professionals are typically, sometimes they have IT, they've got to understand procurement, tax, budgeting, planning, asset management. What does the future of the public professional look like, and how is GFOA supporting its members to be able to get to that space?
So currently, we recognize that as a profession, we do need to be more inclusive. And so we've been very intentional in making sure that the profession is reflective of society, who is in these roles, because that perspective allows you to make decisions that you otherwise wouldn't without it. Most recently is just the role of artificial intelligence. GFOA has actually invested quite a bit in terms of understanding how can we make artificial intelligence be a friend and a value add to to the profession and to what we do. And going back to the fact that we have an aging public finance workforce, the generation of finance officers that we're bringing in are younger and have different skill levels, but the demand of the job also is changing almost on a daily basis. So that's what GFOA has been doing. I think one is this new membership structure as well, but just leveraging artificial intelligence and diversifying who sits in these chairs, in these sessions and in these organizations that we need to be well managed and fiscally responsible and resilient.
And if I may, I just think a lot of other professional bodies around the world should really look at what you're doing, looking at the future professional, looking at how you can use AI to complement your profession. I think you're really leading the way in some of that stuff. If I was to give you one final thought and comment on our conversation, which I've really enjoyed, is there something you'd like to finish on?
Come on. You go first.
Sure. I think it's partnerships. I think it's understanding that this work cannot be done alone. And I think GFOA has begun to has been recognizing this for quite some time, but also understanding that the work is evolving, understanding that we don't exist in silos. There is a globe around us. There are global events, there are national events, there are international events that we have to constantly be cognizant of as we go through our day-to-day. So I think just recognizing that you're not alone, and in bringing others into the decision-making process and into thinking, problem-solving, and not going at it alone.
I would say it's people, skills, and capacity. My grandfather, David, used to always say, give me 5 good people. He used to say men back in those days, give me 5 good men and I'll change the village. Give me 20 good men and I'll change the state. And give me 200 good men and I'll change the country. And I think that hasn't changed. We don't need 10 million people with amazing skills to change the world. I think the statement still is the same. It's give me 5 good men and I'll change the village. But this time I would like to add, give me 5 good men and teach them AI and how to use it. And I think we can change the country. But capacity building, skill base, more and more general managers and CEOs sending their young people to these training programs, building capacity, professional certification in strategic asset management. I think that is absolutely essential and something that can be done with minimal resources and minimum funding.
Yeah, that's a good note to finish on. A sincere thanks to both of you for joining us and also being a part of our conference in Sydney. I really value the partnership and the relationship with GFOA. But I've got one final question for you, Lunda.
Go for it.
Okay. Your predecessor was one of the highest listenerships for her podcast. Are you going to beat her?
Tanya is amazing in so many ways. It would be incredible if I did, but not surprising if I don't.
But you've got one thing over her. You've got an Infrastructure Matters mug. All right, limited edition. Thanks ever so much, gents. I really enjoyed the conversation. Have a good rest of the couple of days of the conference.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
And that wraps up another episode of Infrastructure Matters. A huge thank you to our guests, Lunda Asmani and Ashay Prabhu, for joining us and sharing their insights on the evolving landscape of finance, asset management, and global infrastructure. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope this episode inspired you to think about the critical role of financial leadership and long-term planning in building stronger, more sustainable communities. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review Infrastructure Matters on your favorite podcast platform, and follow us on LinkedIn for updates and exclusive content. I'm David Jenkins, signing off, reminding you that in the world of infrastructure, every detail matters.